Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. Q, great to see you.
Great seeing you, Ian. I am excited this week. We got a young lion on this show.
I know. We have a great guest, the inimitable Thomas Chatterton Williams. Hey, Thomas, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are y'all?
Yes, you're. I think but in the positive way. You know, the people with three names. Um, you're in the positive category. Good to see you. For our guests who may not know the work of TCW, he's a great author, writes for The Atlantic. I think I first discovered your work with Self Portrait in Black and White. There's Losing My Cool, and you've got a new book which we'll talk about, Summer of Our Discontent, which I can't wait. So we'll talk about that. But before we jump into, the Thomas Chatterton Williams of today, the author, the recognized influencer, let's just step back and give our audience a chance to hear from you. When did you realize that race was a thing in your life, that it had some supersized meaning in ways that you could never have imagined?
Yeah, that's such a great question to start with. I wrote about this, and it was much closer to me when I wrote my first book in my 20s. I was really thinking about my upbringing so much back then. Now I'm in middle age, and everything seems quite distant. But I do actually have a moment when I really started to understand racial dynamics and how they would work and how they might affect me. Because the thing is that, as I'm sure you both know, you're not born thinking about these things. It hits you maybe 5 or 6 years old, or sometimes earlier, sometimes later. But I have not the definitive Black American experience, but I have a very common and historical Black experience, which is having one Black parent and having one white parent. That's been happening in this country before it was a country, in one form or another. But as a child, I didn't just think, here's my mother, the white woman making an egg in the kitchen, and there's my Black father, mowing the lawn. I just thought that's my mother and my father, and I had to act, and that's actually the rational, normal response to having family members and loving them and them having different physical characteristics. But I had to go out into the social world and interact with others before they imposed a kind of framework of seeing on me that didn't come naturally to me. And of course, my father, being old enough to be my grandfather and having grown up in the segregated South before civil rights, was also quick to school me into understanding what it meant to be racialized.
So where was this? Where was that?
Where did I grow up?
Yeah.
In New Jersey. So I grew up in what would be called, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. And so I grew up in what would be called neighborhoods that were ethnic white, Italian, Polish, Irish, with somewhere beyond the immediate neighborhood, the immediate vicinity, there being a Black pocket. It was very informally segregated in the kind of New Jersey suburb that I grew up in. And I had to get older and understand why there was a Black pocket and why my father actually, out of principle, resisted the real estate agent's desire to steer us there, and why we were the only family where we were. And that came with some difficulties. It actually would have been socially a lot easier to live in the Black pocket. No one would have actually called me a monkey on the Black side of town if we lived there. But these were things that, gradually I was educated into understanding what it meant where we lived. And it took me until going to university at Georgetown to understand that the white people I was living around were not the only kind of white people there are, and that there is a class dimension to where I was growing up that I had been unaware of. I had seen things in childhood so much filtered through the lens of race that I didn't pick up on some important class distinctions that impact how you think about racial identity too, and I would say demand more nuance.
And so how did that play out? Like, what do you think, what does class mask that a race-only view,
Yeah.
Obscures in some way?
I mean, on the most basic level, and I know both of you are very acquainted with these distinctions as well, um, class masks the idea that we racialize privilege. So, on the most basic level, I grew up in a world where my Black and Puerto Rican friends and I thought that um, all white people, um, in some way, were well-to-do. Because they were slightly more well-to-do than many of us were. Um, but actually all white people are not well-to-do, and we weren't even growing up around the well-to-do white people is what later became apparent. But race, and this is something that W.E. Du Bois and many Black writers have painstakingly pointed out, but race is often used as a way of blinding people to class distinctions. Whites are paid with a kind of psychological wage that allows them to feel superior to Blacks even if their social lot is much closer. These were things that were not immediately apparent to me. But at the risk of going on too long for your introductory question, the world was really something that was not racialized to me until it became black and white. And I was taught outside of my house that I had a white mom. And then I had to learn how to navigate the world knowing that, but knowing also that the white kids that I was around didn't see me as white, and the Black kids that I was around were accustomed, for all the reasons that America imposes, to accepting Black kids of all skin tones, hair textures, and very physical variations, because that's what Blackness has actually always been in this country. It's not strictly how you look. So all of that became clear to me as soon as I ventured out to school and was called a nigger for the first time when it was first grade. I remember it very well.
Thomas, I remember a piece you wrote in the New York Times probably around 2019, and you talked about, you just referenced it, being called a monkey, or a
Mm-hmm.
little effing monkey, I think,
Mm-hmm.
by a white boy. And I want to ask you, do you think that his fury directed at you, was it really just simple jealousy? Because I know you had framed it as you were like jumping over a swing and
Mm-hmm.
you were athletic. Was it simple jealousy? Was this eighth grade boy literally, did he literally hate you because your perceived race?
You know, it's so hard to understand how racism works and how it seems attractive to people. Like, I've never in my life been tempted, if I were alone. I live in France, and the groups that are most salient there are like Muslims and Arabs, and then French people and Christians and stuff, and those divisions are important. And like, it would never occur to me to like whisper an obscenity towards an Arab boy if I found myself alone with him in a room. I can't understand how that mentality works. But if I try to put myself in that boy's shoes, I don't think he hated me. I don't think he hated Black people. I think it was the tool at hand he could use to indulge a kind of desire to be mean, or to exert a kind of dominance or something. He was also older than me. He could have reached for a different tool. I would say, if I was overweight or something, there's many tools that children especially reach for to put the other down. And so it seems to me that that's probably what it was, but also that the tools that were very available in the 1980s and 1990s in a kind of ethnically balkanized New Jersey suburb were often racial tools, racist tools. People said all types of things that it wasn't until the 21st century that it kind of became taboo. People really said nasty things about gays and homosexuality, and like lots of things were permissible to be said that were really kind of nasty. And it's my sense that probably that's what was behind it, and it wasn't a kind of racial ideology, but he was in a larger context that permitted that kind of way of thinking and speaking.
I think that's such an interesting insight. A racial tool. What a way to segregate underlying motivation from a tactic that you might find harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And did you find that similar? It sounds like you just said Black kids didn't really, quote unquote, more authentic Black kids who had a mother and a father who were Black. Did you feel any level of inauthenticity as related to other Black students?
Yes. I think it's very, I wouldn't say that everybody in my situation does, but I think it's very common for there to be, especially, the adolescent years are where people are figuring out their identities no matter what their parents' identities are. But then you throw onto that, the kind of ambiguity of coming from what's called a mixed race background. There's oftentimes a kind of overcompensation that black boys, especially, but black girls too, in my experience, with one white parent, kind of indulge to be, more royalist than the monarch, more more of a royalist than the king. And so I definitely went through a phase where my dark-skinned black friends would be dating a white girl, and I would be like, "What? Are you crazy? Like, like how are you gonna date interracially?" And I'm looking back on it, they were really patient with me. They were kind of just like, are
Dude,
you judging like a person by the color of the skin? Like, what's going on? And I would kind of be, militantly, opposed
so
to that, or
interesting.
I would be, I went through a phase of really kind of embracing a kind of, we were all playing at it. We were to an extent, lucky enough to be in the working class or in the lower middle class, but we were not in the actual, inner city. But we were all playing at a kind of street authenticity that I really became kind of, misled by and really, interested in, that I confused with racial authenticity. So
Yeah.
there was that kind of judgment, but I wouldn't say it was all just paranoia and imagined in my own mind. There was a kind of policing of the boundaries of acceptable blackness that happens in adolescent peer groups. And, there was a sense that, my father is an extraordinarily scholarly man who happens to be black. And there was a sense that I needed to hide some of those more bookish aspects of my home
Mm.
life because it wasn't actually, it wasn't uplifted. It wasn't considered
Yeah.
something to be lauded. It was something that might be tolerated, but it really wasn't supposed to be put to the forefront. There was, I mean, people try to refute this and say that it's an urban legend, but there really was an aspect of you're talking white. That was the reality of my upbringing, that you could be ridiculed for that. And so you tried to, I tried to serve two masters. I served my father's um, demands at home to study and to expect to go to college, and then I served the social master at school to downplay that and to
Wow.
emphasize my interest in athletics and things like this. It's all familiar to both of you, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, no, it is unfortunately familiar. I mean, when I first read Self Portrait, in black and white, you had this concept of unlearning these things, like
Hmm.
unlearning race. So, can you talk about that, and how do we help our society unlearn all these stereotypes around race?
Well, I read a book that really, I think, helped me shift my thinking, called Racecraft: The Soul of Inequality in American Life, by Barbara and Karen Fields, two sisters, that made me rethink some of the categories I just passively accepted, and to think about the origins of why we have what's called black, why we have what's called white, and what the enforcement of the boundary is rooted in, what it means and who it benefits. And so, also at that same time, I was working for the New York Times Magazine, and I profiled an artist and philosopher named Adrian Piper, who has really challenged the kind of categories. And she had a conceptual artwork in 2012 in which she retired from being a black woman. And,
Oh,
and
that's
I
so
was just really
cool.
intrigued by that. And I spent some time talking with her. And I was also at that moment in my life realizing that I was having, my wife was pregnant and we were going to have a child. And it dawned on me that though I simply accepted the one drop rule of black identity, that any blackness makes a person uh, black because they're not white, I realized for the first time, and it was kind of naive on my part, I realized that I could very well have children that physically don't present in any way that's legibly black to the rest of the world, especially since I'm not even living in American society at that time where the one drop rule obtains, but I'm living in France where they have a different way of thinking about racial identity than we do. So I started, realizing that these are categories that are, the hand-me-downs of the plantation, of the Southern plantation. This is slave logic, the idea that that there's an essence that makes somebody black because they're not pure enough for whiteness. And why am I replicating, reproducing this way of thinking? Who does it serve? It certainly doesn't benefit me, and I don't think it would benefit my child, um, who was born with blonde hair and blue eyes and is a descendant of slaves and of European immigrants and Europeans. But she's going to have to navigate society on her own terms. And who does it benefit for her to reproduce this kind of Southern way of thinking? And I want to stress that I didn't say to myself, here I am having a white child. But this moment of epiphany was me saying, what does it mean for me to be a black man who can have a child who looks like this? And I don't want to play this all-American skin game anymore. And I don't want to necessitate that my daughter buys into it either. It's not that I'm having a white child. It's that I'm having a child that maybe will reject or contradict all of these categories and define herself. And of course, we live in a society, and you can only go so far in terms of self-definition, but we don't have to be accomplices to this kind of racecraft, and we don't have to think in ways that I think, reinforce racism, because racism feeds off of the categories and divisions of race. And we can on our own terms say that we will challenge those frameworks. And it hasn't made my life easier, not necessarily, but it's made some of the cognitive dissonance go away, and it's clarified some issues to me that I kind of just glossed over in my own life growing up with a white mom and a black dad, and just without thinking, uncritically, just saying, I reproduce everything that I've inherited in this social framework. Now I don't just reproduce those categories. And if anybody wants to talk to me about how I define myself, we can have a kind of longer conversation. But I'm no longer checking those boxes for bureaucratic purposes, or for facile conversations about privilege and disadvantage or whatever.
Beautiful articulation. Beautiful articulation. Really so important. And this is why you called yourself middle-aged. To us, you're a young lion and such an important part of the heritage of, and I'll use the phrase, Black intellectualism, Thomas Sowell and others. We need you. We need you at your articulation. And though you, in fact, don't need to be called a Black intellectual, some of the ways that you contribute to a better society are around those issues.
Well, thank you so much. And, I would like to emphasize, because people often take exception to the phrasing or think it's a sign of saying that you want to pass into whiteness. That's not what I mean by rejecting the black-white binary. It's that I come from a cultural tradition. I come from a people from a certain geographical region of the country. But I don't think anything about that is what Ralph Ellison said is rooted in blood and skin. Blood and skin don't think. I just want to reject the essential biological category that says that we are different races of people. I think that I do come from a Black cultural tradition that I'm very proud to participate in. I talked about this briefly with Skip Gates, who to me is a hero, and he said, there's a long tradition of Black people challenging these things, and you're taking your place in that tradition, and that's very much still rooted in the ongoing Black conversation. And I love that. I'm proud of that. I also, was inspired to say I'm unlearning race by Black thinkers. It wasn't something that came from outside of that tradition. So I'm very much, and in the book, I try to really cite these people that were so influential on my thinking, including John McWhorter, Glenn Lowry, people that are still working now. Stanley Crouch was a good friend. I didn't get to meet him, but I was deeply inspired by Albert Murray, Ellison's friend from Tuskegee, who said,
the American, yeah.
Any fool can see that the Black people aren't Black and the white people aren't white. Part of what I see is this tradition is trying to think more intelligently about who we are as Americans, as multi-ethnic society, and to overcome some of these inheritances we have from Europe and from the Enlightenment that were ways of thinking about human difference that don't serve our multi-ethnic societies today in any way that, you know, that we should hold on to.
So, Thomas, humor me for a moment. Let's. These questions come from a gross space of generalization, but I definitely want to get your perspective on it. So, firstly, what do white people get completely wrong about black people?
Well, you know, we've been getting at this a little bit throughout the conversation, but I think especially well-meaning white people, like not racists, like the progressive liberals who were so disturbed by, you know, the kind of injustices that they saw. I think that they oftentimes have a benevolent way of homogenizing all Black experience, or believing that there is a Black point of view and there is a Black interest. So they can kind of, out of a desire to be an ally, or a desire to be anti-racist, they can think Black people want, you know, X. So that could be defunding or abolishing the police, and it's horrible what the police did to this Black man, and there's rage in the community, and there's a demand for criminal justice reform. So it's in the Black interest to abolish the police. But any Black person knows, who lives around Black people, that there's quite a lot of disagreement internally within the community about what would be in the best interest. And we know that some of the most, for just to stay with that example, some of the loudest critics of the idea of abolishing the police were the very people living in the communities in which your safety depends on there being a police presence, however flawed it might be. So there's, I think oftentimes white people can just oversimplify an understanding of Blackness as being monolithic. This happens to all minority groups. There's a Jewish point of view, or there's a women's point of view, or a gay point of view, but it's really something perniciously that it sticks with the Black community. And so that's why we've always had, going back to, you know, the times of Richard Wright and James Baldwin, there's always a spokesman that that represents the Black point of view in the kind of mainstream. I think this is actually improving a bit now, but, you know, the last true Black spokesman was probably Ibram X. Kendi, and before that it was Ta-Nehisi Coates. You know, there was one person at a time that was designated to talk for all Black people. So that's a major misconception.
And then let's go the opposite direction. What do Black people absolutely get wrong about white people?
Yeah, well, you know, certainly I would say that also is a risk that, you know, one of the aspects of American society that we actually haven't fully solved is how segregated American life can be. You know, when you get up into the upper middle class and above, it can be diverse in certain ways. Everybody's kind of, you know, socioeconomically successful, and so there will be some Indians and some Arabs and some Blacks and some Latinos, and it can be a bit diverse. But in the day-to-day life of a lot of Americans, they've done quite a lot of research on this. Like, most white people in America don't actually interact with many Black people socially or as equals. They might have them, you know, in service positions, or they might see depictions of Blackness on TV, but they don't live their lives. They don't worship in spaces where there's a lot of Black people. They live a segregated life that's mostly white, and many, maybe even the majority of Black people also don't really live in a on equal terms with socially integrated institutions and spaces and neighborhoods with white people, right? So a lot of Black people think that there's a white point of view as well. And a lot of Black people think that whiteness is synonymous with economic privilege. I grew up kind of having that overly simplified understanding of how race works in America. And so I think this causes us to misperceive the enormous amount of socioeconomic and ideological diversity within white society too. You know, there's a need to tease out what it means to be a J.D. Vance type of white person from what it means to be a liberal, you know, type of white person. And I think that can be superficially accepted, but it's not always appreciated that there's an enormous amount of difference within communities, oftentimes more difference within communities than between communities. So both Blacks and whites still misperceive each other, because I don't believe that we're living nearly as integrated on socially equal levels as we would have expected to by a quarter of the way through the 21st century.
Yeah. I wonder when you use the term well-meaning, if these efforts. So let's take, for example, the term BIPOC, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which
A pet
I
peeve of mine.
find I find to be a very flattening, reductionist, and frankly even insulting category. But as you just said, well-meaning. But so, do you find that sometimes these efforts to be, understanding or showing empathy actually end up exacerbating the very divisions that we're seeking to remedy?
I really do, and BIPOC especially. It bothers me because there's a way in which even critiques of white supremacy really reinforce the idea that white people are superior. Whether racists celebrate that finding and anti-racists lament it, but they both kind of end up in the same place. And one of the ways that you're superior is by being special and not being like everyone else. And so what BIPOC does is basically say, this tiny number of people in the world who are designated white are one thing, and then literally every other human on earth is just one category, which is not white, white being special.
Right.
And I don't know why anybody would want to say that East Asians, South Asians, East Africans, Sub-Saharan Africans, people from Latin America, they're all just not white. They're BIPOC. It's crazy. It makes this binary where whiteness becomes this. It reinforces this this real pernicious notion that the one drop rule is based on, which is that whiteness is a kind of purity, and everything else can be mixed in any way because it's just not white. It's basically the same.
Yes. Yes. So, do you think we could live in a world? So there's a lot of discussion around color blindness. Can we have a colorblind society? And it's a term that I think is often debated. But could we live in a color indifferent society?
Mm-hmm.
So not necessarily color blind, but this idea that skin color has as much relevance as eye color.
Right.
Is that feasible? And if so, how do we even think about getting there?
I sincerely believe that is possible, and I believe we've been suffering some setbacks as far as optimists go lately, but I still believe that is the future that we're headed to, certainly in a society like America. It may not even necessarily be a good thing. There's other problems that come with multiculturalism. I mean, if we're honest, Donald Trump had the least racially polarized Republican victory on the presidential level since Richard Nixon. He knit together a kind of ethnically and racially diverse coalition. So just being, able to see past racial divisions doesn't necessarily even guarantee that you'll be living in a
interesting
enlightened society in a lot of levels. It just means that you might have solved for that problem. But I really do think that we can get there. I don't think we'll ever not notice difference. People look different. Like, I'm not ever colorblind. I think people willfully misinterpret it. And Coleman wrote this, really important book that was an intervention in this conversation, saying that no one's saying that no one will see race. And that's just like a kind of euphemism. Anyway, people see race, but it doesn't have to be the most salient aspect of the person you're dealing with. And I would like to live in a society, and I think we can get there. We do get there already. And all of American society is not in the same place at the same time. In some spaces, you really do get there. Harvard Business School would be a place like this. In some situations, you're in a position to say, I don't know what this person believes, how much money he makes, what his interests are, what his upbringing was like based on how he looks or how she looks. And I actually have to speak to this person as an individual to understand more. We're already far enough away, thank God, from living in, Jim Crow America, where it didn't matter if you were a doctor or a janitor, but you had the same second class Black experience in America because that was, you didn't have civil rights. We do live in a dynamic and surprising society where I think physical characteristics and ethnicity become less and less salient in allowing me to just know a priori who you are. And I think we're going to keep getting there. And, people with my background and others like it are becoming more common. The so-called multiracial demographic in America is the fastest growing one. So I think we will get there, but I don't think actually it's going to solve every problem. And then we're going to have to find new ways of thinking about and addressing the problems that are pretty resilient and that stay with us.
And let me just ask you, so I run schools, and there's constant interest in what are the racial achievement gaps, like what are the outcomes, how they differ by race. Do you think we should eliminate those kinds of questions? Like, does it matter that 40% of black kids, or actually 40% of white kids are reading at grade level, and 16% of black kids are reading? Like, what does that mean? And do us holding on to these racial categories, is it worsening things, especially when the solutions to issues like that are far less related to race? Like in the case of education, it's better teaching. There's a whole bunch of things that are not related to race that could improve outcomes for all kids. But when we are fixated on these categories, it seems to limit and narrow the conversation.
I mean, my inclination is to agree with you there. And maybe it's not perfect, but it reminds me of when with COVID-19, people were talking about it being a black plague, and there was a lot of desire to say black people die from COVID more than white people, and we need to address it. And people called black were actually, hit by this pandemic in ways that weren't necessarily hitting the same proportion of people called white. But the underlying thing going on was not this thing we call race. The thing that was going on was that people called black were living in like more high density communities, or were working in kinds of jobs that were more exposed to risk, or couldn't work from home. Lots of different things. To racialize it, I thought actually obscured ways of seeing it clearly that would allow us to address what was actually going on. And even if it didn't obscure, it wasn't necessarily helpful, because that wasn't the main issue. The issue was that these were people that were in essential work or what have you, or they were poorer people on balance. And so I imagine that similar things are at play with schooling, where the thing is going on is that kids being called black or Latino are actually poor, or they're actually in, communities that are under-resourced or whatever. And it's not a genetic essential aspect. And so are we helping ourselves by racializing that? And is that even feeding into kind of stereotyping that actually presupposes the conclusion? You know this better than me, but I imagine that this is part of what happens where middle-class black students perform below where they should be based on their socioeconomic position, because they're already buying into ideas of black performance and what's expected of them, and what their ideas of how they're supposed to live up to themselves. So I imagine that I certainly would defer to what the educational expertise says here, but I imagine that there is a case for moving away from those categories in education as well.
Well, you mentioned, Kendi before as, one of the leaders. Well, he has this famous phrase. He says, "When I see racial disparities, I see racism, period." End of story.
Exactly.
There is no other explanation. So yeah, it's the perpetuation of these categories. I don't know if they should be eliminated, but our obsession with them often obscures the underlying reasons why those disparities exist in the first place. And even more importantly, it narrows the types of interventions and solutions that should be put in place to address, the disparities, and the fact that in this case, all kids need to be better at educational outcomes.
Yeah, I think so. I think that focusing on any discrepancies among groups is it seems to me like a waste of time for a lot of reasons that you're probably acquainted with from Coleman. But before Coleman, Thomas Sowell was really pointing this out. It would be absurd to think there would never be any differences among groups, because different cultures and ethnicities and genders, they have different things that they're interested in, and they prioritize and emphasize different behaviors. It really isn't that crazy that so many of the top basketball players who are white come from like the former Serbian or like from the Balkans, right? Like they just there's nothing that interesting about thinking that in a cultural context, they emphasize playing basketball more than people from the United Kingdom did.
You got it.
And there is a discrepancy there. And, there is a discrepancy among like different groups of whites too. Like the whites I grew up around, the what used to be called ethnic whites that I grew up around did not emphasize, sorry, I'm sorry about that. They didn't emphasize the same things that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that I met later emphasized culturally necessarily on a variety of issues, not just academically. So, I think we get hung up on just trying to laser focus on ethnic or racial differences and not just try to bring up the floor for everyone and to value, individual dignity.
Yep.
But Kendi is an interesting case. I have rarely seen someone so influential with their ideas being adopted by their society's elites, economic and cultural elites, so swiftly and then so quickly. The ideas being rethought or thrown out because they're very success proved their unworkability. It's been amazing to see, in 6 years or 5 years, because I would say that even last year he was already far less influential. It's just like they implemented the ideas and their very implementation refuted the value of the ideas. It was incredible.
Agreed. Well, let's move to our speed round. So, Thomas, I'm going to throw out some names of people or places and ask you to pick one and tell our audience why. So we'll start with Malcolm or Martin.
This is a speed round, but that's too difficult to choose. Love them both.
Why do you love them both?
Two of the most brilliant American men I've ever seen. The oratorical gifts of both of them are just really difficult to believe. James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King are three of the most gifted speakers I've ever seen in any context, in any country or culture. The idea that they were contemporaries, it makes me wonder what's wrong with our society today. Malcolm X, for his ability to evolve and his enormous human spirit and what he ended up at towards the end of his life, but also even in the beginning of his life, the incisiveness of his mind and some of the social critiques he made that perhaps he was too radical, in retrospect or maybe not, but the quality of his skill in polemic and in motivating people and in caring for his community are to be admired. And Martin Luther King, just one of the most extraordinary Americans, up there with Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, just one of the great Americans, one of the great world figures for his leadership capabilities, but the oratorical gift, but not just in a rhetorical way, the substance of what was being communicated, and the ultimate vision of universal human dignity, not an attempt to be an ethnic or racial chauvinist, but a desire for all people to be able to flourish. The contribution that he made is, it goes without saying. He is the true great American of the 20th century in my mind.
Paris or New York?
That's like Malcolm or Martin. Need both. You have to have both. Paris to raise a family, and New York for my work life and professional life, and for because it's home. But I don't think anybody has ever, if you don't work in fashion and you're not named Marc Jacobs or something, I don't think any American has ever moved to Paris for a job.
And what makes it so great for family?
So for family, what makes it so great is related to probably what makes it so bad professionally. There's social democracy. There's neighborhoods are still, even in central Paris, are still affordable. Very green, walkable. Public schools are diverse and are I think high quality, at least up until high school. My children are in the local public schools, and they meet some kids who have, a de in their last name and are descended from aristocrats, and they meet some kids who live in public housing. And the rich in Paris, which I think is extraordinary, the rich and the upper middle class haven't all just unilaterally pulled their children from the public schools. So they still participate in them. So you actually get everybody benefits from social mixity. So these are part of the reasons why I think it's really a very good society to raise children in. But also, they are, fundamentally, France in some ways is a culturally conservative country, even though that seems strange to Americans because, politically, even their conservatives believe in things like, taxing the rich and, healthcare for all, but they're culturally a conservative society. And so, a lot of the craziest culture war fights we have over gender and over, aspects of our collective life, those don't even really happen in France. So everyone is kind of on the same page socially in ways that are cohesive and that make parenting a little bit easier. You don't have to fight every battle there.
The last one's not going to be any easier. Shelby Steele or Glenn Lowry?
Well, I don't know. So Shelby, this is a lightning round, but I'm messing it up because every question. Shelby's article, he had an essay in Harper's that I read in college that made me want to become a writer, in which he talked about this this aspect of being, of wanting the Black individual wanting to break free, and it was even. It was about a Sidney Poitier movie in which he goes abroad to Europe and as the civil rights movement is happening, and he falls in love with a Black American woman out there, and she says it's time to go home and to join the struggle, and he's torn. I'm blanking on the name of the movie. I apologize, but the Poitier character is torn because the freedom that is being fought for back home, he's actually as an individual experienced it in France. And so what does it mean to be part of a group? What does it mean to be an individual? And I had just never heard somebody write like that. And so it was really inspirational to me. Harper's Magazine was inspirational to me as a place where you could do public thinking. So he really opened my mind to thinking in a way I hadn't prior to that as like a sophomore in college. But I never met him. And then after my first book came out, Glenn Lowry reached out to me on Facebook or something like that, wrote to me, and we became friendly. And, I read Glenn and I listened to Glenn, and he became somebody that I admired so much. So I probably just say the slight edge there goes to Glenn because I have a personal relationship with him. But that's another guy that is one of the most extremely gifted communicators I've ever had the privilege to be around. He just speaks in these perfect crystalline paragraphs. He also does something that I've rarely seen anybody do, which is whatever he believes, he can really steelman the opposite of the argument that he prefers. So I just remember going on his podcast. I spoke in his class up at Brown, and then I went on his podcast, and I know what he thinks about, Ta-Nehisi Coates and what he was thinking about Between the World and Me. And I assumed that we agreed on it. And as soon as the mic started rolling, he just basically hit me over the head with like the strongest version possible of Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument in Between the World and Me. And I was like, wait, Glenn, what is going on here? It was incredible. And he does it all the time. He steelmans both sides of Israel and Palestine or whatever the issue is. He's just got this type of mind where he loves to argue, he loves to think, and he can see things in a very undogmatic way. He's a very, very interesting, and I think, as celebrated he still is an underappreciated public intellectual who many more Americans should engage with.
Excellent.
Yes,
thank you, Tom.
We agree. All right. Wow. We are coming to the end of our time, but we can't leave without giving you an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of our discontent, because even Nike and I, we restarted The Invisible Man as a video podcast back in 2020-21 after we saw the turmoil. So you've just written a book about what transpired in that summer of 2021. Talk a little bit about that and where you see us today. And then I want to give you a chance to provide advice to our 16-year-old Daryl.
Sure. Well, Summer of Our Discontent is a book that I started working on in 2021. began thinking about what was going on a lot, and obviously in the summer of 2020, when it seemed like our society had really come apart and was losing its way under the kind of triple threat of the pandemic, the racial reckoning, and this kind of looming specter of Donald Trump above it all. Looking like we were actually in a liberal democracy crisis, a crisis of liberal democracy. All of that came together, and I think changed. There was a before and after. It was one of those hinge years. So I was trying to make sense of that and trying to understand how we could get back to a kind of center right, center left liberal norm that wasn't this kind of pendulum swing overreaction, which unfortunately it seems we've gotten into now. So I was trying to understand that, the ideas and events that led us from the kind of post-racial euphoria and optimism, and I would say general widespread goodwill of the early Obama era, that 2007, 2008 moment in America when Obama won and even the majority of McCain voters said, I'm proud of our country and maybe we really can solve this. That lasted for a minute. That was real. But then we started down this path of disillusionment on both sides of the spectrum, and we had the kind of the great awakening, as it's called, and this activism that was exacerbated by the use of social media and all this, and the disillusionment with Trump. We got ourselves to a situation in 2020 where we had this breakthrough and this rupture. And so I'm trying to put that all together. It's not something that can be summed up in 5 minutes, and I realize I've already gone on far too long, even in the lightning round. But it's a book that really tries to grapple with recent history, make sense of it, and hopefully point a way towards a saner future, while recognizing that we're very far away from that now. And it's not just the fault of the left; it's also very much an illiberal right reaction to that.
Wow, fantastic! Maybe we'll have you back on once
With
it's actually
pleasure.
released.
Would love
Yes.
that.
So as we talked about, Nike and I started this journey together on The Invisible Men 30 plus years ago during the Rodney King, craziness when, he was acquitted, and there was this narrative that black men are an endangered species. And we created a film called The Invisible Men because we felt folks who were black men who were striving, that narrative was often invisible. And we created this character, Daryl, 16-year-old black kid, single mom, never hearing about folks like Thomas Chatterton Williams. And we just want to end with, what advice would you give to the Daryl of today, who may not be hearing about the improvements, maybe during the summer of our discontent was only hearing about America as this oppressive society rigged against him? What would you say to Daryl?
I would like to reproduce some advice, a few pieces of advice that my dad always emphasized to me when I was navigating kind of the pull of a culture that I think Daryl would recognize, and trying to, with my dad's help, will into an existence a future that wasn't tangible to me yet. My dad was kind of like the dad of the community, so he wasn't just saying it to me; he was saying it to a lot of my friends, like Daryl, who would come over to my house with varying degrees of interest and exertion and study with my dad. One of them, my best friend, ended up, going from that kind of Daryl background to Harvard Law School. So the advice, I think, works. My dad, first of all, emphasized that something that's very unpopular now, but it might not be fully unpopular at Vertex Academies. But my dad said to me, "You are going to have to be twice as good. It's not fair. Life isn't fair. And life isn't just unfair along racial lines, but you're just going to have to accept that you're going to have to work very hard. You're probably going to have to outwork people with advantages over you. A lot of them might be white, but it's not necessarily just based on being white. But you're going to have to work twice as hard because you don't come from a position of privilege." Then he said to me, "I also don't care if we ever have another black athlete or entertainer. It wouldn't bother me in the least if there's never another singer, rapper, basketball player." He said this to me even as he would take time off of work to drive me to basketball camp. He'd say, "Do your best at whatever you're doing, but I don't care if we ever have another black athlete or entertainer, but we do need intellectuals. We do need, like scientists. We need writers. I do care that we have another black valedictorian. I do care that we have another black college graduate, etc." So I took that very seriously, even as I, couldn't imagine not wanting to be a professional basketball player or whatever it was. I always heard my dad in my mind saying that do your best at whatever you do, but also distinguish yourself in realms of human endeavor that really mean something and matter. And then I would say to Daryl that, um, you live in a dynamic society where there is a great inequality, but there's also more human possibility still in this society than there ever was at any other point in time in this world. And so make sure you try to tap into that to the best of your ability, doing what you can where you are with what you have. There's that Murray-esque figure of the jazz player or the bullfighter, just facing chaos and doing what he can with skill and with discipline to confront the chaos for the moment that he's here as best he can. And then there is no perfect hand to play. There's no perfect life. So you do what you can where you are.
Wow. With skill and discipline to deal with the chaos. I love it. All right. Well, Thomas, this is your first appearance on The Invisible Man. Hopefully there will be several others.
I hope so too. And I apologize for the length
No,
of
no.
the answers.
Yeah, it's hard to contain brilliance.
And the questions are so important, so serious,
Yep.
Yes.
All right. Well, more to come. Well, our listeners are very much going to enjoy or have enjoyed this episode and look forward to having you on in the future. And for anyone who wants to see other episodes, you can go to www.invisible.men. And with that, and we're everywhere where podcasts are offered up, Spotify and Apple and all that. So Thomas Chatterton Williams, thank you for joining us. NIQ, as always, good to see you. Any closing thoughts?
Well, Thomas, I'm so proud of you, and your voice really resonates with me. Though we are very different people, and very simply, I'll be a big supporter of yours. And when your books come out, I buy several because I give one to my son, one to my daughter, and one to a good friend. You're an important part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, and books still matter, and I think there's nothing like getting a book from someone that you admire and respect. So thank you for giving the book out. Appreciate it.
All right.